Most gun owners have at least one firearm sitting in the safe that they do not think much about anymore. Maybe it was inherited. Maybe it was bought years ago and barely shot. Maybe it is an old revolver, an old military pistol, or something that just does not feel practical in 2026. And that is where a lot of people make a very expensive mistake. They sell the gun before they understand what they actually have. I have seen it happen. A guy looks at an old handgun and thinks it is just taking up space, so he trades it off, sells it cheap, or lets it go during a move, a rough month, or one of those times when the regular 9-to-5 paycheck is not stretching far enough. And then, a few years later, that same gun is bringing serious money on the collector market. That hurts, because as gun owners, selling a firearm is usually one of the last things we want to do, especially when that gun has history behind it. But life happens. Sometimes the bills stack up. Sometimes you need cash. Sometimes you are moving, downsizing, or just trying to clean out the safe. Still, here is the thing. Not every old handgun is just an old handgun. Some are pieces of American gun history. Some are tied to military contracts. Some have features, markings, production years, or factory details that collectors chase hard. And once those guns leave your hands, getting them back is usually impossible. That is why, before you sell anything rare, you need to slow down and look closer. Because in 10 years, that handgun you almost let go for quick cash might be worth a whole lot more than you think. Maybe thousands more, maybe tens of thousands more. And in a few extreme cases, maybe enough to make you sick when you look back on it. So today, we are looking at the top 5 handguns you should never sell. Colt Single Action Army. The U.S. Army adopted the Colt Single Action Army in July 1873. They called it the M1873. The Army bought a total of 36,000 revolvers chambered in a brand new cartridge built specifically for that gun. That cartridge was the .45 Colt. About 2 months after the military adopted it, Colt brought the revolver into the civilian market. That is where it picked up the nickname Peacemaker, and most people know it by another name, the gun that won the West. The Single Action Army started its run in 1873. Later on, Colt offered the revolver in many chamberings beyond the original .45 Colt. Some of the most important were .44-40, .38-40, and .32-20. At that time, Winchester had already made the 1873 lever-action rifle, famous in .44-40. That pairing mattered. A revolver and a lever gun using the same cartridge made sense out on the frontier. Carry a long gun, carry a handgun, feed both with the same ammunition. That is practical, that is simple, and out in the real world, simple matters. In 1877, Colt answered that demand with the Frontier 6 shooter, chambered in .44-40 Winchester. It sold for around $17.50 each. Between 1873 and 1941, first-generation Colt Single Action Army production reached a little over 357,000 revolvers in different calibers. The original Colt Single Action Army, the M1873, saw heavy use by just about anybody who needed a serious handgun. It used the newly perfected centerfire cartridge. The .45 Colt could push a heavy bullet with serious authority for its day. That was real horsepower in the 19th century. The U.S. Army used it. White settlers used it. Even Native American tribes used it. Across the western frontier, the Colt Single Action Army was everywhere. Now, the military replaced it about 20 years later with the newer Colt M1892 Army and Navy double-action revolver. We will talk about that model again in a little bit. But even after the Army moved on, the Colt Single Action Army stayed in limited military service. Why? Because it's still at that stronger chambering. It saw action in the Spanish-American War. It saw action in the Philippine insurrection. It even showed up during the U.S.-Mexico border conflict of the 1910s. The famous U.S. Army General George S. Patton carried a Single Action Army as his personal sidearm through World War II, and by that point, the gun had already been fading out of normal circulation since the end of the First World War. A decade after World War II, Colt brought the Single Action Army back in 1955. Westerns were popular again, and the gun fit that image perfectly. This time, each one sold for a much steeper $125 compared to its old Frontier-era price. To this day, older 19th century model 1873 revolvers and peacemakers are highly sought after by collectors. So how expensive can these revolvers get? On May 19, 1987, the New York Times reported that an original Colt Single Action Army M1873 sold for a massive $242,000. That purchase happened decades ago. Adjusted into 2026 dollars, that same sale lands closer to about $700,000, depending on the inflation calculator used. That is why you do not treat a rare old Colt like ordinary clutter. Pre-2020 Colt Python. Every serious gun person who knows revolvers understands this. The original Colt Python is one of the finest revolvers ever made. That does not mean it was perfect. It had a few downsides, and those issues eventually helped push production to stop for more than a decade. Even after the 2020 Colt Python remake came along, many shooters and collectors still view the original guns as some of the most collectible revolvers on the market. The Colt Python was designed from the start as a luxury target revolver, so both its form and its function had to be top tier. Colt gave it special treatment in production. You had the custom-built, high-precision barrel. You had the hand-fitted trigger assembly. You had the high polish on moving parts and non-moving parts. And you had that rich, deep, royal blue finish. The Colt Python was in a class of its own. When it hit the market, it became a major success almost immediately. Decades after its introduction, the Colt Python became one of the most expensive and most desired .357 Magnum revolvers of its era. But there was a problem. All that hand-fitting took time. All that manual labor cost money. Building a single Python became expensive, so Colt had to sell it at a much higher price just to make a profit. Eventually, the Colt Python became unprofitable, and Colt had to stop regular production. At the same time, more affordable handguns were everywhere. Polymer-framed, high-capacity semi-autos were taking over. Most were chambered in 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, and 45 ACP. From the year regular production stopped in 2005 until the new 2020 version arrived, many pre-owned Pythons in mint condition were selling for around $3,800 on average. Some earlier production guns climbed past the $10,000 mark. Now, granted, the market for older Pythons is not exactly the same as it was before the new production guns came back. The modern 2020 version changed things, but that does not erase the collector demand. There are still buyers out there willing to pay extra for a clean vintage Colt Python in mint condition, and older Pythons are only getting rarer. That matters even more in 2026, because CZ Group has owned Colt since 2021. Collectors know there is a difference between the older hand-fitted guns and the modern production revolvers. Some people even joke and call the newer ones the CZ Python. That is not the official name, but it tells you how collectors think. That is the detail a lot of sellers miss. A clean pre-2020 Colt Python is not just another revolver. It is a piece of American wheel gun history. FN Browning High Power T-Series. Originally released in 1935, the Browning High Power is one of the most popular high-capacity semi-automatic handguns of the past century. It became a widely used service sidearm for military and law enforcement personnel in many countries. For decades, it had a serious reputation. A Belgian firearms company called Fabrique Nationale de Herstal, or FN Herstal for short, approached John Moses Browning about designing a new handgun. The goal was to create a standard-issue sidearm for the French military. But there was a complication. Colt had purchased the rights to Browning's earlier masterpiece, the Model 1911, and had it patented shortly after. So Browning had to come up with a different design. Unfortunately, he never got to finish it. John Moses Browning died in 1926. Another firearms designer working for FN Herstal, Dieudonné Joseph Save, stepped in to complete Browning's unfinished design. After years of constant revisions, the new handgun was finally introduced in 1935. It was a semi-automatic pistol chambered in 9mm. It held 13 rounds in the magazine, and it arrived 9 years after John Moses Browning passed away. That same year, the Belgian Army adopted the Browning High Power as its standard-issue sidearm. Years later, That design became a template for many firearms engineers building double-stack 9mm handguns. And even today, the Browning High Power still has a deep footprint in military, law enforcement, and collector circles around the world. The most desirable versions are the ones known as T-Series guns. They show a letter T in the serial number. Depending on condition, they can sell for as high as $3,000. Produced from the end of the Second World War up to 1973, these T-Series Browning High Power pistols are considered by many enthusiasts to be the best versions for fit and finish. They were also among the important models associated with the external extractor era. That external extractor is generally considered more durable and easier to replace than the internal extractor used on earlier examples. The classic Browning High Power line was discontinued around 2018. After that, other companies stepped in. Springfield Armory released the SA-35. Girsan released its Turkish MCP-35. That helped fuel a comeback in popularity, and that resurgence pushed FN to introduce the modern FN High Power in 2022. By 2026, there are even more high-power style pistols and clones floating around the market. But that does not make the old T-Series guns less interesting. It actually reminds people why the original guns have the reputation they do. Even with all those modern reproductions, there are still collectors willing to pay top dollar for a mint-condition T-Series Browning High Power. That is where old-school quality still holds weight. Pre-World War I M1911 or pre-World War II M1911-01. The Colt M1911 is one of the most iconic pistols ever produced, maybe the most iconic. Anyone who has ever had even a passing interest in firearms has probably seen a 1911 at least once, but not everyone knows the history behind it, and that history deserves its own full video. So we are not going to deep dive every detail here. We are just going to touch on the part that matters for this list. As the model number tells you, the model 1911 was formally adopted by the U.S. Army in 1911. That happened several years after John Moses Browning began designing magazine-fed, autoloading handguns. Before the 1911 was adopted, the Army's standard-issue sidearm was the Colt Model 1892. Like I mentioned earlier, the Model 1892 was chambered in .38 long Colt. That cartridge was weaker than the .45 Colt, which was the original chambering for the Colt Single Action Army we already talked about. The Model 1892 was not as powerful, but it had lighter recoil. That made it easier to handle. It also had a swing-out cylinder, which allowed faster reloads. Those were two big reasons the U.S. Army adopted it. Shortly after the Spanish-American War, American soldiers sent to Jolo and the Sulu Islands in the southern Philippines came face-to-face with native tribal warriors. They were locally referred to as the Moro Juramentados. These were fighting men who seemed almost unaffected by the .38 long Colt. That created a serious problem. The U.S. Army then commissioned 6 firearms manufacturers to build a semi-automatic handgun. The requirement was clear. It had to fire a .45 caliber projectile. Colt submitted John Moses Browning's autoloading pistol design. It proved to be the most durable and reliable option, and the rest is history. Today, polymer-framed, high-capacity compact and subcompact handguns chambered in 9mm dominate the market. But the 1911 and .45 ACP is still one of the most widely available handguns in the world. Budget-oriented, plain Jane mil-spec models from Turkey or the Philippines can cost around $300. But not all 1911s are created equal. If you have a pre-World War I M1911 or a pre-World War II M1911A1 in good working order, it can bring serious money. Depending on condition, the value can land somewhere around $2,000 to $55,000. The rarest examples go much higher. One of the big ones is the M1911A1 that the U.S. Army commissioned Singer to manufacture in 1941. Those guns are record holders. One specific example sold for more than $400,000 just a few years back, but only 500 of those were ever made, and even fewer are still in circulation. All 500 were reportedly issued to U.S. Army Air Corps personnel. At that time in the war, those air crews had very low survival rates. That makes the Singer M1911A1 one of the rarest 1911 models in existence. so do not be shocked if you never find one in the wild. But if you happen to own one that was handed down by your grandfather or great-grandfather, you are one very, very lucky 1911 owner. Hold on to it for at least 10 more years if you are thinking about selling it. Depending on provenance, condition, originality, and documentation, the best examples could keep pushing higher. That is not a pistol you casually let walk out the door. Pre-World War II and wartime Walther P38. The German Army adopted the P08 in 1908 as its standard issue sidearm. Most people know it as the Pistola Parabellum, or simply the Luger. The P08 was considered more reliable than the C96 Mauser, which the German Army had adopted earlier. But there was one big issue. The Luger was expensive to produce. So the German Army started looking for a replacement. 30 years after the Luger was adopted, in 1938, it was replaced by a more cost-efficient 9mm pistol, and for its time, that pistol was way ahead of the curve. It was designed and developed at the Walther firearms plant under the work of Karl Walther and Fritz Barthelmess. It received the military designation P38, short for Pistolet 38. The P38 was one of the most advanced semi-automatic handgun designs of its day. It introduced several technical features that are still found on modern civilian and military pistols. Designed from the ground up as a military sidearm, early production Walther P38 models built a reputation as excellent fighting man sidearms. They were compact, rugged, reliable, accurate, and easy to maintain on the battlefield. That matters when a handgun is not just something you shoot on a clean range bench. It has to work in rough conditions. The design was good enough that long after the Second World War, the German military continued using the post-war P1, which was closely related to the P38. The P1 served through the Cold War and into the modern era. The Heckler & Koch USP-based P8 was adopted in 1994. But the older P1 remained in service during the transition and was finally phased out around 2004. Pre-World War II and wartime models are some of the most sought-after versions of the Walther P38. Depending on condition and the actual year of manufacture, one of these can easily sell for $3,000. Older P38s made in 1938 only had the Walther banner on the slide. Wartime models had one of 3 slide codes stamped on them: AC, BYF or CYQ. The AC code points to Walther, the BYF code points to Mauser, the CYQ code points to Spreework. To this day, the rare wartime P38 variations can bring serious money. Some especially desirable AC-marked examples, depending on date, markings, matching parts, finish, and documentation, can climb from several $1,000s into much higher collector territory. So if you own a Walther P38 with an AC, BYF, or CYQ mark, resist the temptation to sell it. Give it maybe another decade or so. You may see a serious jump in price. That is the kind of old military pistol collectors keep chasing. And that is my list of the top 5 handguns you should never sell. There may be other handguns out there that you wanted to see in this video. If so, let me know down in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe, and click that bell icon so you do not miss any new content. As always, thanks for watching.